The California sun blazed mercilessly over Beverly Hills, its rays reflecting off the polished surfaces of luxury cars and gleaming mansion gates like 1,000 tiny mirrors. The temperature had reached 92 degrees by noon, and the asphalt seemed to shimmer with heat waves that made the entire street look like a mirage. Sophie Miller dragged her feet along the pristine sidewalk, her worn sneakers making soft scuffing sounds against the immaculate concrete. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself was conspiring against her already weakened body. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. The last meal had been a shared bag of stale crackers with another homeless girl at the downtown shelter, but even that small comfort felt like a lifetime ago. Her stomach had long since stopped growling. Now it just ached with a hollow, gnawing pain that seemed to echo through her entire torso. The water fountain at the public library had been her only source of hydration, but even that was miles behind her now. Her lips were cracked, her mouth dry as sandpaper, and every breath felt like it was scraping against her throat. Sophie's faded denim jacket hung loose on her thin frame, the fabric worn soft from countless washings in shelter laundromats. Underneath, her white t-shirt bore the telltale stains of someone who had been living on the streets too long. Despite her desperate attempts to stay clean, her dark brown hair, once her pride, now hung in limp strands around her face, unwashed and tangled. But her eyes, those deep green eyes that had once sparkled with dreams and ambition, still held a flicker of determination, even as her body betrayed her. The mansions she passed seemed to mock her with their grandeur. Manicured lawns stretched like emerald carpets behind ornate iron gates, while Mediterranean-style facades and modern glass structures stood as monuments to wealth she could barely comprehend. The contrast was stark and painful. Here she was, 22 years old, and invisible to the world, walking past homes that cost more than most people earned in several lifetimes. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was literally dying of hunger in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in America. Her vision began to blur as she approached the intersection of Maple Drive and Bedford Drive. The famous Beverly Hills street signs, normally crisp and clear, seemed to swim before her eyes like objects underwater. She blinked hard, trying to focus, but the effort made her head pound with a rhythm that matched her irregular heartbeat. Her knees felt weak, trembling with each step, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead, despite the fact that she should have been dehydrated. That's when she saw it. The Whitmore mansion. Even among the impressive homes lining this street, it stood out like a crown jewel. The modern architectural masterpiece rose 3 stories high, its clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows creating an almost ethereal appearance. The exterior was a combination of white stone and dark wood accents, with a perfectly manicured landscape that looked like it belonged in a magazine. A circular driveway curved gracefully around a central fountain, and the main entrance was framed by 2 towering palm trees that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Sophie found herself stopping in front of the imposing iron gates, her hand instinctively reaching out to steady herself against the cool metal. The contrast between the cold, hard barrier and her burning skin was startling, and for a moment, the sensation grounded her. She stared through the bars at the mansion beyond, wondering what it would be like to live in such a place, to never worry about where your next meal would come from, to sleep in a real bed every night, to feel safe and secure within those walls. The thought triggered a wave of emotion that caught her off guard. Tears began to well up in her eyes, not from self-pity, but from the sheer exhaustion of fighting so hard for so long. She had been on her own since aging out of the foster care system at 18, bouncing from couch to couch, job to job, always one step away from complete destitution. The last job, working at a small diner in downtown LA, had ended 2 weeks ago when the owner decided to close permanently. Her final paycheck had barely covered the deposit for a weekly motel room, and when that money ran out, the streets became her only option. As she stood there, gripping the gate, Sophie felt her legs begin to give way. The world started to tilt sideways, and the beautiful mansion in front of her began to spin like a carnival ride. She tried to take a step back from the gate, but her coordination was completely gone. Her vision tunneled, growing darker around the edges until she could only see a small circle of light in the center. The last thing she remembered was the sensation of falling backward, her body going limp as consciousness slipped away from her, like sand through her fingers. The impact with the concrete sidewalk was surprisingly gentle in her mind, though her body hit with a dull thud that echoed slightly off the surrounding walls. Her dark hair fanned out around her head like a halo, and her arms fell to her sides in a position that looked almost peaceful, as if she had simply chosen to lie down and rest. The afternoon sun continued to beat down on her still form, and the street remained quiet, except for the distant hum of air conditioning units working overtime in the luxury homes. From inside the Whitmore mansion, the sound of the fall had been audible through the open windows of the first-floor office. Daniel Whitmore, who had been reviewing quarterly reports at his mahogany desk, looked up with a frown. He wasn't accustomed to any sounds penetrating the usually serene environment of his property, and something about the noise seemed urgent, almost desperate. Setting down his expensive fountain pen, he walked to the window and peered through the sheer curtains, his ice-blue eyes scanning the street for the source of the disturbance. What he saw made him freeze in place, his breath catching in his throat as he processed the scene before him. Daniel Whitmore stood motionless at his office window for several seconds, his analytical mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A young woman lay unconscious on the sidewalk in front of his property, her body crumpled in a way that suggested complete physical collapse, rather than a simple fall. His first instinct was to call his security team, or perhaps 911, maintaining the careful distance he had cultivated between himself and the outside world. But something about the scene held him captive, compelling him to look closer. She was thin, almost gaunt, in a way that spoke of real hunger rather than fashionable dieting. Her clothes, while clean, were obviously worn and mended in several places. Even from his second-story window, Daniel could see that this wasn't someone who had simply tripped while jogging through the neighborhood. This was someone in genuine distress, someone who had fallen not from clumsiness but from sheer physical exhaustion. The billionaire found himself moving toward his front door before he had consciously made the decision to get involved. Daniel Whitmore was not known for impulsive actions. Every decision in his life, from business acquisitions to charitable donations, was carefully calculated and thoroughly analyzed. He had built his fortune on the principle of emotional detachment, never allowing personal feelings to cloud his judgment. Yet here he was, practically running through his marble foyer toward a complete stranger. The Beverly Hills afternoon heat hit him like a wall as he stepped outside, the California sun reflecting off the white stone facade of his mansion with an intensity that made him squint. He had lived in this house for 7 years, but he rarely ventured beyond his climate-controlled sanctuary during the peak heat of summer days. The contrast between his cool, pristine interior and the harsh reality of the outside world was stark and uncomfortable. As Daniel approached the unconscious girl, he could see more details that made his chest tighten with something he couldn't quite identify. Her face, despite being flushed from heat and dehydration, had delicate features that spoke of a natural beauty, unmarred by cosmetic enhancement. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and he could see the rapid flutter of her pulse at her throat. Dark circles under her eyes and the hollow appearance of her cheeks told a story of prolonged hardship that he recognized from his philanthropic work, though he had never encountered it so directly on his own doorstep. Miss, can you hear me?" Daniel's voice, normally commanding in boardrooms and conference calls, came out softer than intended. He knelt beside her on the hot concrete, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping against the sidewalk, as he positioned himself to check for signs of serious injury. His hands, manicured and soft from a life of privilege, hovered uncertainly over her still form. He had never actually administered first aid to anyone, though he had donated millions to medical charities. Sophie's eyelids fluttered slightly at the sound of his voice, but she remained unconscious. Daniel could see that her lips were severely chapped, and her skin had the papery quality that indicated severe dehydration. Without thinking, he slipped one arm under her shoulders and another under her knees, lifting her carefully from the concrete. She weighed far less than he had expected, her body feeling almost fragile in his arms, like she might break if he held her too tightly. The walk back to his front door felt both endless and instantaneous. Daniel was acutely aware of how inappropriate this situation was by his usual standards. He didn't bring strangers into his home. He didn't get personally involved in problems that could be solved with a phone call to the appropriate authorities. Yet every step toward his mansion felt right in a way that defied his logical mind. The cool air of his foyer provided immediate relief from the oppressive heat outside. Daniel carried Sophie through the grand entrance hall, past the crystal chandelier and marble staircase that led to the upper floors, toward the guest suite on the main level. The room was elegantly appointed but rarely used, decorated in soft blues and whites with furniture that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. He laid her gently on the king-sized bed, her small form looking almost lost among the luxury linens. Daniel found himself studying her face as she lay there, noting the way her dark eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, and how her hair, despite its unkempt state, caught the light filtering through the silk curtains. There was something about her features that suggested strength beneath the vulnerability, a quality he found both intriguing and unsettling. He had spent years surrounding himself with people whose motivations were transparent, usually involving his wealth or social status. This girl, lying unconscious in his guest room, represented something entirely different. He called his personal physician Dr. Matthews, a discreet professional who had been caring for the Whitmore family for decades. While waiting for the doctor to arrive, Daniel found himself pacing the length of his office, unable to concentrate on the financial reports that had seemed so important just an hour earlier. Through his window he could see the spot where he had found her, now empty except for a small water bottle that had apparently fallen from her jacket pocket. Dr. Matthews arrived within 20 minutes, his silver hair and kind eyes providing a calming presence in the otherwise tense atmosphere. After a thorough examination, his diagnosis was straightforward but concerning: severe dehydration and malnutrition. He explained quietly to Daniel in the hallway outside the guest room. She needs immediate fluids and gradual reintroduction of food. I've started an IV, but she's going to need several days of careful monitoring to recover fully. Several days? Daniel repeated, the implications of that timeline settling in his mind, like stones dropped in still water. At minimum, Doctor, Matthews confirmed. Moving her to a hospital would be possible, but honestly, she'll recover better in a quiet, stress-free environment. The body heals faster when it feels safe. The doctor's knowing look suggested he understood more about Daniel's character than the billionaire was entirely comfortable with. As evening approached and Dr. Matthews departed with promises to return the following day, Daniel found himself alone in his mansion, with a stranger sleeping in his guest room. The house, which had always felt appropriately spacious for a man who valued solitude, suddenly seemed enormous and echo-filled. He stood in the doorway of the guest suite, watching the steady rise and fall of Sophie's breathing, wondering what impulse had driven him to bring her inside. The IV bag hung from a makeshift stand that Dr. Matthews had assembled, its clear fluid slowly dripping into the thin tube that disappeared under the white hospital tape on Sophie's hand. Even unconscious, she looked more peaceful than she had on the sidewalk, as if her body had finally found the safety it needed to begin healing. Daniel realized that for the first time in years, he had made a decision based purely on instinct, rather than calculation, and surprisingly, he didn't regret it. Sophie's return to consciousness was gradual, like emerging from deep underwater, where sounds were muffled and light filtered down in strange, dreamlike patterns. The first thing she noticed was the absence of hardness beneath her body. Instead of concrete or the thin mattresses of shelter beds, she was lying on something impossibly soft that seemed to cradle every part of her aching frame. The second thing she noticed was the smell, clean and fresh with undertones of expensive fabric softener and something that might have been lavender. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against light that was gentle rather than harsh. The ceiling above her was painted a soft cream color, with crown molding that spoke of architectural attention to detail she had only seen in magazines. As her vision cleared, she became aware of her surroundings with growing confusion and alarm. This was not the downtown shelter where she had last been sleeping. This was not any place she recognized at all. The room was elegant in a way that felt almost surreal. Floor-to-ceiling windows draped in silk curtains let in filtered afternoon sunlight that painted everything in golden hues. The furniture was clearly expensive, from the mahogany nightstand beside her bed to the antique writing desk positioned near the windows. A crystal vase holding fresh white roses sat on the dresser, their perfume adding to the overall atmosphere of luxury and refinement. Sophie tried to sit up quickly, panic rising in her chest as she struggled to remember how she had gotten here. The movement made her head spin, and she noticed for the first time the IV line attached to her left hand. The sight of the medical equipment sent her heart racing as fragments of memory began to return. She remembered walking through Beverly Hills, feeling increasingly weak and disoriented. She remembered stopping at a mansion gate, gripping the iron bars as her vision blurred. Everything after that was darkness. The sound of her movement must have carried beyond the room, because within moments she heard footsteps approaching in the hallway outside. Sophie's instincts, honed by months of living on the streets, kicked into high alert. She needed to know where she was, who had brought her here, and most importantly, what they wanted from her. Her experiences had taught her that nothing came without a price, especially not kindness from strangers. Daniel appeared in the doorway, and Sophie's breath caught in her throat. He was tall, probably 6 feet 2 inches, with the kind of commanding presence that comes from years of being in charge. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his ice-blue eyes seemed to take in everything about her condition in a single glance. He was wearing casual clothes, dark jeans, and a white button-down shirt, but even his casual attire looked expensive and perfectly fitted. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, which only intensified Sophie's confusion and wariness. "You're awake," he said, his voice carrying a slight relief that seemed genuine. "How are you feeling?" He remained in the doorway, as if he understood that approaching too quickly might frighten her further. "Where am I?" Sophie's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, her throat still dry despite the IV fluids she had been receiving. She pulled the expensive duvet up to her chin, suddenly aware that someone had changed her clothes. Instead of her stained t-shirt and worn jeans, she was wearing a soft cotton nightgown that was clearly new and expensive. "You're in my home," Daniel replied, stepping just inside the room but maintaining a respectful distance. "You collapsed outside my front gate yesterday afternoon. I brought you inside, and my doctor has been treating you for dehydration and malnutrition." His explanation was straightforward, but Sophie could hear something in his tone that she couldn't quite identify. Concern, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. Yesterday afternoon. Sophie tried to process this information. She had lost an entire day, possibly more. The implications were staggering and terrifying. "Your doctor?" she asked, her voice gaining strength as the IV fluids continued to work their way through her system. "Dr. Matthews. He's been taking care of my family for years. He said you're going to be fine, but you need rest and proper nutrition." Daniel moved to the chair near the window, settling into it with the easy grace of someone accustomed to being in control of every situation. "Can you tell me your name?" Sophie hesitated, every survival instinct telling her to be cautious. She had learned to be wary of kindness, especially from people who clearly had the resources to help, but might want something in return. "Sophie," she said finally, deciding that her first name couldn't hurt. "Sophie Miller. I'm Daniel Whitmore," he replied, and Sophie felt her stomach drop as she recognized the name. Whitmore was synonymous with wealth and power in Los Angeles business circles. Even someone who had been living on the streets had heard of Whitmore Industries and their philanthropic efforts throughout the city. She was lying in the bed of one of the most powerful men in California, and she had no idea what that meant for her. "Why did you help me?" The question came out more aggressively than she had intended, but Sophie needed to understand his motivations. In her experience, powerful men didn't help young women without expecting something in return. She had learned that lesson the hard way during her first weeks on the streets. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider his answer carefully. "I'm not entirely sure," he said finally, his honesty surprising her. "I saw you fall, and I couldn't just leave you there. It seemed like the right thing to do." He paused, studying her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "When was the last time you ate a proper meal?" The question brought tears to Sophie's eyes before she could stop them. She turned her head away, embarrassed by her body's betrayal of emotion. "I don't need your pity," she said, her voice tight with suppressed tears and injured pride. "It's not pity," Daniel replied quietly. "Dr. Matthews said you're severely malnourished. That doesn't happen overnight." There was no judgment in his voice, only a factual observation that somehow made it harder for Sophie to maintain her defensive walls. She looked back at him, studying his face for signs of deception or ulterior motives. What she saw instead was something she hadn't expected: genuine concern from someone who had no reason to care about her well-being. It was so foreign to her recent experience that she didn't know how to respond to it. 3 days, she admitted quietly. Maybe 4. I lost track. The admission felt like a defeat, acknowledging just how far she had fallen from the dreams she had once held for her life. Daniel nodded, his expression remaining carefully neutral. "Doctor?" Matthews left some instructions about reintroducing food gradually. "Are you hungry now?" He stood up from the chair, and Sophie noticed that his movements were careful and deliberate, as if he was being conscious not to make any sudden gestures that might alarm her. Sophie realized that she was, in fact, hungry, in a way that went beyond the gnawing emptiness she had grown accustomed to. The IV fluids had begun to restore her body's basic functions, and for the first time in days, she felt like she might actually be able to keep food down. But accepting food from him felt like accepting charity, and that was a line she had sworn never to cross. "I can't pay you back," she said, the words coming out harder than she intended. "I don't have anything to give you in return for this." She gestured at the room, the medical equipment, the obvious expense of everything around her. "I'm not asking you to pay me back," Daniel replied, and something in his tone made Sophie look at him more carefully. Sometimes people help each other simply because it's the right thing to do. No strings attached. Sophie wanted to believe him, but her experiences had taught her to be suspicious of kindness without conditions. Still lying in this comfortable bed with fluids flowing into her veins and the promise of food, she found her resistance beginning to weaken. Maybe, just this once, she could allow herself to accept help without questioning the motives behind it. 3 weeks had passed since Sophie first opened her eyes in the Whitmore mansion, and the transformation was remarkable. Her cheeks had regained their natural color, her eyes had lost their hollow appearance, and she moved with the grace of someone whose body was no longer fighting malnutrition. Dr. Matthews had pronounced her physically recovered, though he had noted quietly to Daniel that emotional healing would take much longer. The guest suite had become her sanctuary, a place where she could rest without constantly looking over her shoulder for danger. Daniel found himself looking forward to their daily conversations more than he cared to admit. What had started as simple check-ins on her health had evolved into longer discussions about books, current events, and their vastly different life experiences. Sophie had a sharp intelligence that had been honed by necessity and survival, and her perspectives on the world challenged his assumptions in ways that were both uncomfortable and invigorating. She saw through the comfortable illusions that wealth could create, pointing out realities that he had insulated himself from for years. This particular morning found them in the mansion's library, a 2-story room lined with leather-bound volumes that represented Daniel's passion for collecting first editions. Sophie sat in one of the deep leather armchairs, a cup of coffee warming her hands as she studied the spines of books that were worth more than most people's cars. She had been quiet for the past hour, and Daniel could sense that something was troubling her. "I need to leave," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Daniel looked up from the financial journal he had been reading, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He had been dreading this moment while simultaneously knowing it was inevitable. Sophie had recovered her strength, and her pride would eventually demand that she reclaim her independence. "Where will you go?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I'll figure something out," Sophie replied, but Daniel could hear the uncertainty beneath her determined words. "Maybe I can find work at one of the restaurants downtown. I have experience in food service." She set down her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly, betraying her nervousness about facing the world again. "What if you didn't have to leave?" The words came out of Daniel's mouth before he had fully processed the thought. He had been considering various options for helping Sophie transition back to independence, but this particular idea had formed in his subconscious over the past several days. Sophie looked at him with confusion, and something that might have been hope. "What do you mean?" Daniel set aside his journal and leaned forward in his chair, his business instincts taking over as he organized his thoughts. "I've been thinking about expanding my personal staff. I need someone to help manage my schedule, handle correspondence, assist with my philanthropic projects. It would be a real job, with a competitive salary and benefits." He paused, watching her face carefully. "You're intelligent, organized, and you understand people in a way that most of my employees don't." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either connect their worlds or collapse under the weight of their different backgrounds. Sophie's first instinct was suspicion. She had learned to question generosity, especially from men with power and resources. "You're offering me charity disguised as employment," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "No," Daniel replied firmly. "I'm offering you a job because I think you'd be good at it. The fact that it also solves your housing situation is a side benefit, not the primary motivation." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds that separated his world from the streets where Sophie had been surviving. "I've watched you these past weeks, Sophie. You have insights about people and situations that I've never encountered in my business circles. You see things that I miss because I've been insulated by privilege for too long." Sophie joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the subtle scent of the expensive shampoo she had been using. "And what happens when you get tired of having your assumptions challenged? When you decide that my perspective isn't as valuable as you thought?" Her questions came from a place of deep hurt, born from a lifetime of people who had started with good intentions, but ultimately decided she wasn't worth the effort. Daniel turned to face her, his ice-blue eyes meeting her green ones with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Then you'll have gained valuable work experience and saved enough money to start fresh somewhere else. But I don't think that's going to happen." He reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. "I think we both have something to learn from each other." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities and unspoken feelings that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Sophie had spent so long protecting herself from disappointment that the idea of trusting someone with her future felt terrifying. But she had also come to know Daniel over these past weeks, and she had seen glimpses of the man beneath the billionaire facade. He was lonelier than he admitted, more vulnerable than his public image suggested, and genuinely committed to using his resources to make a difference in the world. "What about when people find out about your background?" Daniel asked gently. "Beverly Hills society can be particularly cruel to people they consider outsiders." Sophie lifted her chin with a defiance that reminded Daniel why he had been drawn to her strength from the beginning. "Let them talk," she said. "I've survived worse than gossip. Besides, maybe it's time some of these people heard from someone who understands what the real world looks like." A smile tugged at the corners of Daniel's mouth, the first genuine smile Sophie had seen from him since she had been in his home. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It's a yes to the job," Sophie replied carefully. "With conditions. I want a real employment contract, with clear expectations and responsibilities. I want to earn my place here, not be handed it because you feel sorry for me." She paused, gathering her courage for the next part. "And I need you to understand that I'm not going to pretend to be something. I'm not to fit into your world." "I wouldn't want you to," Daniel said, and the sincerity in his voice made Sophie's carefully constructed walls crack just a little bit more. "Your authenticity is exactly what's been missing from my life." As they stood there in the library, surrounded by books that contained countless stories of transformation and redemption, Sophie felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since she had aged out of foster care, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unexpected, but it felt like the beginning of something real. Outside the library windows, Beverly Hills continued its daily rhythm of luxury and privilege, but inside the mansion, two people who had lived on opposite sides of society's divide were discovering that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures, but from the simple choice to see another person's worth. The billionaire who had spent years insulating himself from emotional connection, and the young woman who had learned to expect disappointment from everyone she trusted, were about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The choice had been made, and there was no going back.